Acheron owners rejoice as Jiaoqiu is finally here. There's no denying the solid synergy between Acheron and this NPC. But is he really gonna be stuck with Acheron? Is he just a fire version of Pella? You might think that's a weird comparison, but I know that one reduces enemy defense while the other increases all types of damage taken by the enemy. So in this guide, I'll give you a proper analysis of Jiaoqiu's kit and see whether defense reduction is really that much different from vulnerability or not. If you found the guide helpful, consider liking the video and subscribe so you don't miss out on up-to-date information. I always read everyone's comments, so feel free to ask questions that were not answered in the video. Without further ado, a Foxian healer and a counselor from the Jiaoqiu often greets people with a smile on his face and a scheme in his heart. Born into a prestigious alchemy commission family, he once withdrew from practicing medicine due to a broken heart. However, he returned to the field to treat the Merlin's Claw, General Fei Xiao. Skilled in the study of alchemical prescription that views food as medicine, especially those that induce a sense of spiciness. Jiaoqiu is a 5-star element character that specializes in increasing the damage enemies receive from all sources and inflicting fire damage over time. He follows the Nihility path. Jiaoqiu's kit is centered around his unique debuff called Ashen Roast. Ashen Roast is a combination of vulnerability and burn damage over time. Using level 10 talent, the first stack of Ashen Roast increases the damage taken by the enemy by 15%. Then, each subsequent stack increases this by 5%. Ashen Roast caps at 5 stacks for a grand total of 35% vulnerability and lasts for 2 turns. Duration is refreshed whenever a new stack is applied. Jiaoqiu can apply Ashen Roast stacks through the following. When Jiaoqiu hits an enemy with any of his attacks, there is a 100% base chance to inflict 1 stack of Ashen Roast through his talent. Jiaoqiu's skill is Blast type, therefore would apply Ashen Roast stacks to all enemies hit. It is noted specifically that there is a 100% base chance to apply Ashen Roast on the main target. Basically, this means that Jiaoqiu could apply 2 stacks on the main target of his skill. Then, there's Jiaoqiu's ultimate. First, it will set the stacks of Ashen Roasts on all enemies to the current highest number of stacks active. For example, if the highest number of stacks active is 3, then all other enemies will have 3 Ashen Roast stacks. Next, it will create a zone that deals fire damage to all enemies. This attack specifically triggers his talent. Therefore, it would apply an additional Ashen Roast stack to all enemies. All enemies in the zone receive 15% more damage from ultimates. It is not a unique multiplier and is considered a vulnerability debuff. Therefore, it will be additive to Ashen Roast's vulnerability. At the same time, whenever enemies in the zone take their turn, there is a 60% base chance of being inflicted with another stack of Ashen Roast. This effect can trigger up to 6 times for Jiaoqiu's ultimate. Trigger count would reset whenever Jiaoqiu uses his ultimate again. The zone lasts for 3 turns, and the duration would only decrease at the start of Jiaoqiu's turn. When new enemies enter the combat while Jiaoqiu's zone is still active, they will be inflicted with the current highest Ashen Roast stack through his A6 trace. So if the highest stack currently is 5, then these new enemies will be inflicted with 5 Ashen Roast stacks. Entering new waves also counts for this trace. For example, if Jiaoqiu's zone is still active upon entering second wave, the enemies in this wave will be inflicted with the highest Ashen Roast stacks previously. This also applies to multi-phase bosses whenever they enter their next phase. Other than that, here are some important things to note. If Jiaoqiu enters the battle with his technique, it will inflict damage at the start of each wave with a 100% base chance to apply an Ashen Roast stack. This means that if he changes his technique, skill, and ultimate, the enemy would immediately suffer from 4 stacks of Ashen Roast. As soon as enemies take their turn, they will trigger the other effect of Jiaoqiu's ultimate and cap the Ashen Roast stacks to 5. Jiaoqiu's A2 trace gives him 15 energy on battle entry. On modes where you start at 50% energy, this means Jiaoqiu will have a total of 65 starting energy. Using skill with an energy rope would provide Jiaoqiu 35.8 energy, which allows him to cast his ultimate after his first turn. Jiaoqiu's A4 trace converts every 15% effect hit rate stat that exceeds 80% into 60% attack increase up to a maximum of 240%. Basically, you will need a total of 140% effect hit rate stat to get the maximum attack increase from this trace. Is reaching 140% necessary? No. However, if you are able to reach 140% effect hit rate, then Jiaoqiu's 60% base chance debuff applications will have 86.4% chance of landing against enemies with 40% effect resistance. There's quite a confusion when it comes to defense reduction versus vulnerability. Both debuffs function the same way. They both make enemies take increased damage from any sources. Yes, that includes breaks, super breaks, and damage over time. The major difference is that vulnerability is straightforward. If it says 20% vulnerability, then the enemy will take 20% more damage from any sources. Meanwhile, defense reduction starts weak and only gets stronger as you stack more of it. Vulnerability stacks diminishingly. Let's use Guinaifen and Pella as examples for now. You might have seen me saying Guinaifen is just Pella, but no one uses Guinaifen due to how slow she stacks her vulnerability. Assuming level 12 traces, Guinaifen's Fire Kiss can stack up to 4 times with her final Eidolon, which increases the damage the enemy receives by 30.4%. Pella's 42% defense reduction would translate to 28.21% damage increase, assuming there's no other defense reduction sources. You can see clearly that no one wants to go through all that trouble into stacking Fire Kiss 4 times just to get almost the same damage increase provided by Pella. Things only get worse when you take into account their equipped light cones. Let's assume that both are equipped with a rank 5 resolution LC. Since vulnerability and defense reduction are multiplicative to each other, we simply need to multiply 30.4% to 9.15% to get the final damage increase you get from Guinaifen. 1.304 times 1.0915 equals to 1.423, which translates to 42.3% damage increase. We simply add 16% to Pella's 42% defense reduction, which then translates to a 43.64 damage increase. So with just the light cones added, Pella already pulls ahead of Guinaifen. On top of being easier to use, Pella could also apply an extra 20% defense reduction through her technique. Taking that into the equation, she can provide up to a total of 69.08% damage increase on the first wave. Even if we only consider second wave onwards, if the damage dealer can at least ignore 20% of the enemy's defense, then they would still have their damage increased by 69.08%. In Guinaifen's case, a damage dealer with 20% defense ignore can only get a total of 60.7% damage increase from her. To summarize, there is no real difference between defense reduction and vulnerability. They both increase the damage taken by enemies from all sources, just that Guinaifen is so bad at stacking vulnerability, which is a character design problem, and the fact that defense reduction mechanics favors teamplay. Now let's go back to Jiaoqiu. So how does Jiaoqiu fare against Pella? First of all, Jiaoqiu obviously doesn't have the same issue as Guinaifen, where Guinaifen takes years to reach her max potential. The comparison will be limited to debuff potency. Let us use the same assumption that the damage dealer can ignore 20% of the enemy's defense, and Jiaoqiu will be wearing a rank 5 resolution LC. For all damage sources except ultimate, Jiaoqiu would be able to provide a 66.37% damage increase. For ultimates, it will be an 84.9% damage increase. With this, you can see why I personally call him the Fire Pella. The damage boost they provide is quite similar. Pella has always been useful for her toughness damage against ice-weak enemies. With Jiaoqiu, however, we now have something for fire-weak enemies. Obviously, for min-maxing purposes, Pella's E4 would make her automatically better at supporting an ice damage dealer. Jiaoqiu would be better with a damage dealer whose main source of damage is their ultimate. But let's not forget about Jiaoqiu's A6 trace, where he can continuously apply max stacks of Ashen Roast on enemies entering the battle, enemies on the next wave, or bosses entering their next phase as long as his zone is active. This is such a game-changing passive for a support Nihility, as it fixes their core problem. Jiaoqiu's first Eidolon increases the damage dealt by allies against enemies suffering from Ashen Roast by 40%. This is a damage percent buff, meaning it is additive to other damage percent sources. Jiaoqiu becomes a strong combination of Nihility and Harmony with this Eidolon unlocked. Additionally, his talent now applies 2 Ashen Roast stacks whenever triggered. Jiaoqiu's second Eidolon improves the burn effect of Ashen Roast from dealing 180% to 480% fire damage over time. This Eidolon would make Jiaoqiu a legitimate main damage dealer for DOT teams. There is no denying that Kafka and E2 Jiaoqiu would be an extremely strong pair. Jiaoqiu's fourth Eidolon reduces the enemy's attack by 15% when his zone is active. Jiaoqiu's final Eidolon allows the Ashen Roast stacks accumulated by a dying enemy to be transferred to another enemy with the lowest stacks. Additionally, the maximum stack limit of Ashen Roast increases to 9, and each stack now reduces the enemy's all-type damage resistance by 3%. With level 12 traces, this means that at 9 stacks, Ashen Roast will provide 60.5% vulnerability and 27% all damage resistance reduction. In most cases, Jiaoqiu simply needs to act as the team's enabler, whether solo or paired with another support. Even though it is nice to have another support option that can provide damage boost for the team, he would still be inferior to Robin or Ranmei. I'm saying this so you don't blame me for pulling him because I said he can be a good support for the whole team. Harmonies are just built differently. Similar to Pella, he's not gonna be your top priority pick unless there's some strong synergy with him and your damage dealer. Jiaoqiu is good at boosting ultimate damage and applying debuffs. These are the biggest factors when choosing your main damage dealer. The most obvious strong synergy will be with Amarynn. Amarynn wants a Nihility pair to activate her trace. Her best relic set requires the enemy to suffer from multiple debuffs. Jiaoqiu has a huge damage boost for ultimates, which is Amarynn's main source of damage. And finally, Jiaoqiu, like Guinaifen was, is an excellent battery for Amarynn. Next is Ratio, who wants enemies to suffer from multiple debuffs, which activates his trace and best relic set. Unfortunately, the free follow-up attacks Ratio gets from his ultimate does not benefit from Jiaoqiu's ultimate vulnerability. Only the initial hit of Ratio's ultimate would. Next is Kafka. Jiaoqiu should be using a DOT build when pairing with her. They'd be excellent to use if the enemy is weak to both lightning and fire elements. Even though Jiaoqiu cannot match Black Swan in terms of DOT potential, he can enable Kafka better. Next is Yunli, whose ultimate counterattacks are considered as dealing ultimate damage. Finally, there's Argenti, whose main damage source is his ultimate. Firefly and Himeko as special mentions since both need help breaking the enemies faster so they could do more damage. Super breaks being boosted by vulnerability is a plus. Overall, Jiaoqiu is a pretty strong damage amplifier. Should you try to pull for Jiaoqiu if you have the chance? It really depends. The biggest reason to pull for Jiaoqiu is if you own Acheron. As explained earlier, the synergy is just too good, and if you only have one slot for Annihility in Acheron's team, Jiaoqiu is automatically the best for it. Silverwolf would only be better in single-target scenarios, which is not that common. His A6 trace is a game changer for Nihilities focusing on support. The core problem of support Nihilities is how they need to reapply their debuffs on new spawns, next wave of enemies, or when the boss enters its next phase. These problems do not exist for Jiaoqiu. Not worth the pull if you are looking for a team enabler that is as strong as Robin or Ruanmei. Being a Fire Pala isn't a compliment either. That's basically saying you're pulling for a limited 5-star that has similar performance to a 4-star.
And that wraps up this video. My collaboration with Amarynn will end here, and maybe she will be back in the future. As a form of celebration, she sing for you.